My name is Emma Hickey. I work for Greenwich Library. I am so happy to introduce to you Elizabeth Cline, our newest feature on the Authors Live series. And Elizabeth Cline is New York City based. She is a clothing resale expert. She is a conscious fashion author, and she is a journalist. And she is the author of 2012 book Overdressed, The Shockingly High Cost of Cheap Fashion, and her newest book from August of 2019, The Conscious Closet. Welcome, Elizabeth. We're happy to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here too. And here's a copy of the book.
Before delving into the book, could you give us your elevator pitch on the book, specifically for people who aren't so familiar with what a conscious closet is and, what the industry is in general?
Yeah, so The Conscious Closet is both a wardrobe building guide, so it's a how-to book, but also an educational resource for people who are, one, looking to understand how their clothing is connected to social justice, environmental issues, and then, of course, how to sort of rebuild your relationship and your connection with clothes. It's very, very accessible. It's fun. It's all about kind of giving people guilt-free and satisfying, joyful ways to reconnect with what they wear.
Yeah, I really like that, the positive spin you put on it, because that's really important. And before delving even deeper, I have a very important question for you. You talk about hanging your old fast fashion pieces with your luxury, with your vintage, and your ethical pieces in the same closet in harmony, wearing them in harmony. I would like to ask you today what you are wearing. I know we can't see much of you, but what are you wearing on this Zoom that's important to you?
Yeah, so I am a big vintage. I love vintage shopping. A lot of my pieces are 80s and 90s vintage power dressing pieces. I don't know, I just feel confident when I put them on. So this is actually a vintage silk Escada bomber jacket. I can't show you, but there's like a bird dog's head on the back of it. I'm trying to think where I got this thing, because I collect Escada everywhere I go. I've gotten it at estate sales, local vintage stores. I found some pieces on the RealReal. But yeah, it's one of my favorite things to collect is vintage Escada. So that's what I'm wearing today.
Yeah, it's a really cool statement piece. I love it. Very, very memorable.
Yeah, thank you.
So delving into the book a little bit more, specifically in the introduction, you go over some basics for basic terms before delving into the actual content of the book. Some three significant terms you talk about are fashion fast, magic wardrobe number, and closet contentment. You talk about these as very personal and even emotional, and for each individual. Could you delve in briefly into what each one means and what they should feel like when you're undergoing these processes?
Okay, so we're going to talk about the fashion fast, closet contentment, and the magic wardrobe number.
Yes.
So all of these tools in the book are really a way to just get people out of you know how we all sort of just get sucked into mindless consumption? And the book is really about pausing and opening up space in your life to be more intentional about clothes, because the industry is a huge polluter. It's one of the biggest users of modern slavery. There's a lot of really intense exploitation that's happening in the clothing industry. So I don't want people to feel guilty about these things necessarily. I want people to understand what's going on. So with the fast fashion, for example, it really is what it says it is, which is just putting your shopping habits on pause for a week, a month, a few days, however long it takes you to personally just sort of like shake things up and start to think more clearly about your wardrobe. So closet contentment, that was the second idea you were asking about. Closet contentment, I think, is really powerful because it kind of goes against this narrative that as consumers, we're insatiable. We can never have enough. I think in particular, as Americans, we're constantly being advertised to, we're always told that what we need is one more piece of fashion, one more piece of furniture for our house, you know, and then we'll feel fulfilled. But of course we know that that's just this constant treadmill and it never ends. So closet contentment is really about that pursuit of satisfaction and just saying, you know what, no, I have enough and I can just enjoy the clothes that I have and find joy in the possessions that I already own. And then the third thing you wanted to talk about was magic wardrobe number. Okay. So magic wardrobe number, I really love this concept because one of the things I wanted to show with the conscious closet was that everybody has a different relationship to clothes. I have learned this from talking to audiences all over the world over the past 8 years. Some people have no interest in fashion. They own 5 pairs of pants and 5 tops. So their approach to building a conscious closet is going to be very different from that person who is an Instagram influencer who really does want to post something different every day, who really, really loves trends. So the magic wardrobe number kind of accommodates all of those people. It basically, the concept is simple. It's that you have a number of pieces in your closet that work for you. And as soon as you find that, it starts to make getting dressed a lot easier. And you don't feel like you're on this constant treadmill of needing more and more and more and more stuff.
Yeah, I really like that. I like how you kind of delving into the next question, this is related. You make it very apparent at the beginning that this book is for anyone.
Yeah.
Don't feel intimidated, as you mentioned. And part of that is discovering your fashion personality type. You talk about 3 main types. Obviously, there are offshoots, and you can lean more toward one. That you talk about the minimalist, the traditionalist, and the style seeker.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, they're all very different personalities. My question is, if you want to go into, brief one sentence about each one and talk about, is there one thing that they all have in common that they could do, have this, use as one tool, or do you think they all really need to have the same, different approaches to transforming their closets?
That's a really good question. So, so the style seeker is the person that loves fashion, they love trends, and really they would just wither without a lot of novelty and change in their wardrobe. The minimalist is the person who is going to be very content with a small but very curated wardrobe. So that's the person that's going to really be pursuing quality over quantity. And then the traditionalist is just the person in the middle. They like some trends, but in general, they kind of wear, they have a core curated wardrobe at the center of their closet. And I think that what they all have in common, the style seeker, the traditionalist, and the minimalist, is that they can all use the same components. I talk about the conscious closet components. Whether you're a minimalist, a style seeker, or traditionalist, you can rent, you can buy secondhand, you can support ethical and sustainable brands, you can wear what's in your wardrobe. All of the tools are available to you. So yeah, that's what I would say they all have in common.
Yeah, that's great. So what you're saying is using the same tools, but underneath those categories, maybe, the minimalist might get 2 under that category, whereas the style seeker might get 10 or something like that.
Well, yeah, because a style seeker, you're probably going to rely more heavily on renting or using resale platforms. Shopping secondhand is probably the best way to keep up with trends and do it sustainably, other than renting for special occasions. Whereas usually with minimalists, what I see them doing is investing really into timeless pieces that they're going to have for a long time. And the minimalist is someone that's also going to spend more money per piece because they are buying less. And style seekers spend in a totally different way. But yeah, they all can use the same components to build their wardrobe.
That's great. I think that's really useful jumping off point for people who, especially like I mentioned, do not know where to start.
Mhm.
Going into more of personal action, specific personal action, you talk a lot about affordability / accessibility, materials, and washing / drying. And in terms of individual impact under those categories, I know that for affordability and accessibility, you give a lot of great hacks. And, you know, accessibility doesn't necessarily equal affordability. Maybe accessibility equals, might equal just easy to access information on how to get easy palatable information on how to get, you know, more conscious pieces or to transform your closet. So what are your top 3 tips for people approaching this journey in terms of affordability and accessibility that, you know, someone will walk up to you on the street and ask you?
So the first thing that you have to do when you're starting to think about building a conscious closet when it comes to finances is to understand how you already spend on clothes. You know, I've met a lot of fast fashion shoppers who sit down and tally up how much they've been spending on clothes, and they're shocked. They're totally blown away. They had no idea because they're spending $20 here or there, so it feels like you're not spending a lot of money. And so I walk people in the book through how to really keep up with your finances when it comes to clothes, because clothing can just be one of those kind of silent creeping budget busters where you're spending a lot of money over time and you don't realize it. So the first thing is just get real with yourself about how you are spending money on clothes. Are you really not spending that much, or do you just think you're not spending that much? Because then you can start to take the money that you are spending or the money that you want to spend and put it towards the clothes that you feel good about. I'm really a huge believer in budgeting for clothes, or at least knowing how much of your income you want to spend on what you wear. I definitely feel like because of fast fashion, we've been pushed into believing that clothing should be a throwaway purchase. It should be something that should cost the same as a cup of coffee. But really, most of us with some strategic planning and saving, you can afford better clothes, whether it's through buying secondhand. That's like a huge part of it, or just being more mindful about where your money is going.
Yeah, I think that's what I really loved is introducing that practicality to it, because I think that makes a huge difference. So I think that's very useful for people watching. And moving on to materials, you talk a lot, you delve into most mainstream materials that people can find in their closets, from linen to hemp to rayon, etc. And obviously there's drawbacks and there's benefits to each. For you personally, if someone asked you recommendations on materials, top three materials based on durability, sustainability, style, environmental impact, what would be your top 3, you would say? I know it's a hard question because there's so many drawbacks and good points, but what would be your top 3?
That's really, really tough. I talk in the book about how all textiles have an impact on the environment. The textile industry is there's just a lot of resources that go into our clothes, whether it's water, energy, chemicals in the form of pesticides and cotton, chemicals used to dye and finish clothes. So I really don't believe that there's this dichotomy that exists between natural and synthetics. It all takes a lot of resources to create. That said, when it comes to sustainable materials, I would say there's probably 3 easy things you can look for. The first, I would say, is start to look for recycled materials. They're becoming more common. I know a lot of athletic brands, swimsuit lines are starting to use recycled plastics instead of virgin polyester. And that's great because it uses less energy. And obviously it's not using crude oil to make these materials. So recycled materials would be number 1. Number 2, if you're buying natural fibers like cotton or linen or silk, I'm a huge fan. almost everything in my wardrobe is natural materials. But if you want to just make those more sustainable, look for organic. That really does make a difference, because that means you're not creating cotton with a bunch of pesticides. And then the third thing, and this is like a little bit more technical, but if you encounter anything made out of rayon, those are tree-based fibers, and they can be made from deforested land, which you don't want that to happen. So if you see viscose or rayon, try to find something that is made out of sustainably managed forests, clean chemistry. Just think critically when you see viscose and rayon, and try to find brands that aren't greenwashing and who are actually making that textile in a sustainable way.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really useful. Specifically when you talk about organic cotton, it's really astounding. You delve into the impact of cotton. I think people equate natural is always better, but you also have to look at these other aspects of natural as organic. So that's a very useful piece of advice for people. And then going into washing and drying, you talk about a lot, how people get their garment in their hand, they think the impact is done, and that's far from the truth. There is a huge impact coming from washing, especially drying. Could you go into your top 3 tips for laundering in a more sustainable, less impactful way for the environment?
Sure. Well, I first have to lay out what the problem is. Like one of the issues, especially in the US, is that, because we're so heavily advertised to by detergent companies and appliance makers, we wash our clothes too much. I know that sounds really strange. We associate constantly doing laundry with being hygienic, but it's not necessary to wash your clothes after every single time you wear them, unless you were really got dirty and you really got sweaty. These machines that we're using just use so much energy, and they use so much water. And in the US, we also use very large appliances. Like our washer and dryers, they're just even bigger than in other countries. So they are just energy hogs, resource hogs. So the top 3 tips for greening your laundry routine. The first, this is so easy, and we all know we should be doing it anyway, is to wash on cold. I know it can be kind of hard to get over that mental leap because we associate scalding hot water with cleanliness. But in fact, laundry detergents have been reformulated to get our clothes clean in cooler temperatures. So go ahead and turn that water down to cold, because your washing machine, 90% of the energy of that machine goes towards heating the hot water. So 1, wash on cold. The second thing would be, if you can, switch to line drying or air drying more of your clothes, because tumble dryers, they just use a lot of energy. Any appliance that heats air is going to use a lot of energy. And the really great thing about line drying is that it'll make your clothes last way longer. So it's just a win-win. And then the third tip would be to wash your clothes less. Really, I promise. Like, people think that they're going to start to smell if they skip, if they wear something 2 or 3 times. It's really not the case. So yeah, those would be my 3 main tips for greening your laundry.
Yeah, they're very simple and easy to follow. It's just a matter of, I know we're used to a certain culture here in the US. So thank you. That was very useful. I want to continue on into activism, because you have a chapter about activism in the industry. So starting with COVID-19, in light of COVID-19 and people watching who don't know, maybe you can delve into this further. Western retailers have canceled billions of dollars of orders that have already been fulfilled in February, and by garment workers in factories that are not getting paid now. Retailers like Kohl's, retailers we know. And many people are saying now it's time to look at fundamental changes in this industry. Mm-hmm. Do you see an implementable path forward for more change? And also, do you see any hopeful bright spots? Because I always try to stress the bright spots and the hope.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the pandemic kind of revealed where change needs to happen in society across all sectors. And the same is true in the apparel industry. You know, we have this huge ethical and sustainable fashion movement, but at the same time, you've got garment workers who completely bore the brunt of this crisis. Like, they're the ones that are going to be pushed out of a job. They're the ones who are already going hungry. So moving forward, the question is, how do we build better safety nets? It's a question we've been asking in the United States about essential workers. And that conversation has got to be expanded globally to the people in supply chains who make our clothes. So yeah, there are all sorts of, I think, really exciting conversations happening about how to make that happen. And I think probably, you know, not to get too in the weeds on it, but we have to move away from voluntary commitments from brands. You know, brands have been saying for years, we're going to be sustainable, we're going to be ethical, we're going to be sustainable, we're going to be ethical. But they just keep proving that, you know, when push comes to shove and it really matters, what they're going to do is protect their profits and protect their shareholders and not protect the workers that need these jobs. So yeah, I mean, we're going to need like fundamental legal reforms, but I think that where consumer power comes in is just holding brands accountable, individual brands accountable. Like, for example, Kohl's, they paid their shareholders $109 million in dividends when they owe their factories $150 million. That's unacceptable. And that's something that consumers can speak up about right now.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and to people watching, knowing that you have that power, that's that to voice your opinion and to message on Instagram. So I think that's really inspiring. And you do touch on that in the book a lot, with talking about how brands have a standard that they hold themselves against, but how can they really hold themselves against a standard that they create for themselves?
Yeah.
So very, very interesting.
I think it's also, you know, with the cancellations, it's showed the importance of holding individual companies accountable. Like, we often talk about the fashion industry as if it's this one monolith, right? But brands all kind of operate differently and on a spectrum of behavior. And so, you know, you've got companies that when the cancellation crisis happened and consumers called them out, they immediately changed their minds. They were like, okay, we're going to pay. So that was companies like H&M, Zara, PVH, Target. But then there are all these other companies, like Ross Dress for Less, Kohl's, Gap, that are very profitable companies that haven't paid. So those are the companies that we need to hold accountable.
And do you think if it weren't for our call out culture on social media, that, you know, because they were caught, they wouldn't have done so?
Oh, I'm 100% sure they wouldn't have paid. Yeah.
Yeah. And in that same vein of changes,
I also don't know. I mean, calling out companies, calling out corporations, like, we have to remember that corporations aren't people. You know, they're institutions that have legal and moral and fiduciary responsibilities to society. So, you know, that is where they have a responsibility to all of us. And we have a responsibility to call them out when they do something wrong as well.
yes, definitely, 100% agree. So kind of in that same vein, with COVID-19 and its impact on the fashion industry, obviously a lot's been happening with people realizing that their supply chains are totally out of their control, production being done in Italy, in Asia. Do you see, because of this, and based on your expertise, do you see a more localized supply chain in our future, maybe the garment industry coming back here due to these realizations?
I really don't understand why people think that a local supply chain is going to necessarily be a more ethical supply chain. You know, Los Angeles is the sweatshop capital of the United States, we already have a domestic clothing industry that's not ethical. So while I totally support domestic manufacturing and I would love to see more clothing made here, that does not mean that we are going to have an ethical and sustainable fashion industry by default. And likewise, there is no reason why we can't make global supply chains ethical. You know, where their laws can be changed, trade deals can be rewritten, contracts can be rewritten, purchase orders can be rewritten, bankruptcy laws can be changed. We can figure this out. So, you know, I support local production, but I also think that there is such a thing as just an ethical globalization too.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've seen that with the various certificates, outside body certification bodies that you mentioned in your book, and those are key actors I know you talk about as well. Kind of under the umbrella of COVID, obviously people are facing financial crises right now personally. Do you think that this will impact people in terms of trying to stretch their closets further? Or do you think it might have the opposite effect and people just want to quench that thirst for fast fashion or for fashion, I should say, and will continue to buy cheap things because that's what they can afford?
I think the crisis is just going to kind of fuel a continuation of what's been going on. Like we've got fast fashion just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more profitable and more profitable. And as consumers and advocates, we're doing a disservice to the movement if we pretend like fast fashion doesn't exist. We have a responsibility to reform the industry. But at the same time, there's been this huge awakening of consumers and citizens changing their values, reconnecting with what really matters, and really wanting to see a just and fair society. And that's where I think these two paths that we're on, fast fashion growing and conscious fashion growing, need to converge. I think the goal needs to be to reform the fast fashion industry instead of pretending that it doesn't exist or trying to build this movement of consumers that shop in other places. You know, the point needs to be to change the system, to change the fashion industry so the whole thing is ethical and sustainable, and so that people who are never going to prioritize this issue can still go into a store and choose well, because ethical and sustainable fashion is the only option. It's the whole, it's everything that's available. That's really the goal.
Yeah, and I think your point about incredible self-reflection right now, because people are home and because people want to make positive changes, that's a great point. And kind of hoping it makes a transformation for the better, not just on an individual level, on the industry level. And more in terms of specific action, a lot of people are cleaning out their closets while home. And as you know, and as probably a lot of people who drive by donation bins know, a lot of them are either overflowing or aren't taking donations. Do you have any advice for people for right now during the pandemic for donating or for selling to not further burden our supply chains and burden our donation centers?
Yeah, that's a great question. For now, and you and I are talking last day of June, so this minute, everything's changing day by day, right? I would say clean out your closet, but hold on to things until the donation centers start to open back up, warehouses, sorting facilities start to open back up, because right now there's not really a lot of places for it to go. I think the one exception is, I know from talking to the people who work at ThredUp that they are taking donations, sorting donations, and they say it's getting to the right place. So if you just have to get rid of things, that might be your best option right now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. In the same way we rapidly purchase clothes, it seems like when we want to get rid of something, we just want it out of the way right then and there. So I appreciate you saying that, because I think, that is really important to not place further burden.
I mean, I think maybe I say this in the book, but it's like garbage is political, and there's this whole supply chain and all of these people involved in making our garbage disappear. And we know garbage doesn't really go away. It just goes somewhere else. And the same thing is true of our clothing. And one of the things that I talk about in the conscious closet clean out, which is the first step in the book, is to just be really mindful about how you get rid of clothes, but also what condition you get rid of them in. Because I know from working in the industry that sometimes people get so busy and they just want to get rid of things that they don't even bother to clean their clothes. So that's one really simple thing you can do is anytime you're cleaning out your closet, take the time to clean things, repair them, really give them the best shot at having a second life. It really does make a huge difference.
Yeah, you reiterate that a lot, and I think I didn't even know that, and I think a lot of people don't realize that, and it's a great way to use the last respect to your clothing.
Mm-hmm. And respect to the people who are going to handle, handle your clothes.
So in the same subject matter, under the same subject matter of activism in the fashion industry, you have this quote toward the end of your book, fashion has the potential to combine different movements, including sustainability, living wages, gender equality, and racial justice into one global spanning force for positive change. So as I've mentioned, we are in a moment of incredible self-reflection so specifically talking about the Black Lives Matter and the protests with realization of existing racial tensions in the U.S. This is across all industries, as most problems are, as you mentioned. Do you see these realizations changing the fashion industry? Not just globally for the garment workers making our products who are largely people of color, more so even on the business side, in the corporate offices here in the U.S. I know it's a kind of a big question.
No, I think that's what, people always try to say that fashion is frivolous and it doesn't matter. But when as soon as the Black Lives Matter protests started erupting, the conversation immediately centered on the fashion industry. One, with where were people looting? There was all this focus on people stealing from these corporations who steal from poor people in other places. Most retail workers are brown and Black people who were not paid a living wage. And all of these conversations that go ignored and overlooked in the fashion industry were suddenly, they've been happening for a while, but they boiled over and they just came to the forefront immediately. And it makes sense because if you think about, really to get into it, the origins of capitalism, the origins of exploitation of Black and brown people in our society go back to the textile industry and slavery, which was created to grow cotton for the textile industry. All of this goes back to the clothing industry. So all these conversations are happening now about how do you diversify not just your executive team, but the products that you carry in your store, your advertising, the way you represent cultures in the clothes that you make and design. And, for me, I've always been a labor rights activist. So for me, it's also, like all of us, it's like this challenge and this call to action to stop thinking of things in this siloed way and bring all of these movements together. Like I said it in the book, but it's a call to action to me as well, like to stop thinking of things as separate issues. All of this stuff has to go together: gender, race, class. We all have to combine it into one movement for justice.
Yeah, I think that systems thinking approach is really important, knowing that our however small, our actions impact a greater movement. And in relation to that, do you see any actionable change going forward for individuals watching this, for example? What can they do specifically in the fashion industry to support this inclusivity and to make that known that's what they want to see as a change?
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think. I want to make sure I get this right. Aurora James, what is her 15% pledge? Is that what it's called?
Yes, for the Black-owned businesses.
15% pledge, right? Yeah. So what is so amazing about this moment right now is like yes, we have consumer power. We can vote with our dollars. But what's happening now is people are being asked to call their representatives to sign petitions. We've got the 15% pledge to make sure that huge retailers carry a certain percentage of Black-owned designers and companies. On social media, people are sharing lists of all the Black-owned designers in the world. Like, absolutely, like, support those brands and those companies. Make sure that your feed is not just white people. Start listening to black voices in the ethical and sustainable fashion community. I think that we're just moving into a space of like true civic change and participation. You can also just hit the streets and join a protest if that's what floats your boat.
Yeah, it's important to know that whatever your talent is, there's a place for you in it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And so as kind of a summary of both these major topics under activism that we've spoken about, you've talked about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh as incredible reckoning moments. And I know you've mentioned this as a moment for realization of needing a safety net in the fashion industry.
Mm-hmm.
Would you also call this a reckoning moment because of these two aspects we've just spoken about, the realization of racial injustice and the COVID-19 realizations and the canceling of the orders?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, the biggest reckoning in the fashion industry certainly in our lifetimes. And I would also like to point out that the cancellations, it's estimated brands originally canceled almost $40 billion. The number of jobs and the amount of people that immediately impacted made it the most catastrophic single event in the apparel industry potentially ever. But the campaign to get brands to pay that money and to get factory workers their money back has also been extraordinarily impactful. And then, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement has showed how all of these issues are interconnected. We're talking about the same system of racial capitalism that's exploiting everybody. And I think ultimately, like, the demand is about changing the structure of power. Like right now, brands and really just a few people in brands control everything. They get all the profit, they have all the decision-making power. So really what we're asking for is a seat at the table for garment workers, retail workers, Black designers, for everyone that is currently left out of the benefits of the system to have a say and to have control over the future of the industry.
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot to tackle, but it's good to see that a lot of these are coming to light and people are demanding that change, and that change is actually starting to happen.
Yeah.
And so kind of conclusion questions, referring to something you mentioned earlier, we've been inundated on Instagram with constant lists of Black-owned businesses, and you're very active on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you've discovered anyone that you would like to shout out. Doesn't have to be fashion designers, could be fashion, could be jewelry, could be food, art, etc. If there's anyone you wanted to shout out that you recently discovered that's a Black-owned business.
I have, yes, Hifatra, Hifatra. It's a upcycled bag design, New York based Black designer, beautiful, beautiful stuff. So highly recommend. And Custom Collaborative is another New York based company that they're doing face masks right now. But it's a collective of designers, but you can go on and like buy clothes on their website as well. So those would be the two I would recommend.
Yeah, so everyone should definitely check them out. They're doing a lot of great things. So in addition to a lot of the research you've done, you also speak to industry professionals. You are an industry professional yourself. Was there anything you learned in your book throughout your interviews with these professionals that really challenged a notion you had, could be anything small or big.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think that the conversation of putting, you know, racial justice at the center of this conversation um, has forced me to change the way I think about the industry, because I got into this, you know, always thinking about class politics and economic justice, right? So now the conversation, you always have to be thinking about, well, how does racism factor into how the industry, how the fashion industry is operating, and how can we root that out to make this industry more equitable? Because even if you look at, in the United States, the way that the garment supply chains break down, most of the garment workers that are being exploited in Los Angeles, they're Latino immigrants. You know, there's always the race element is always there. So I think that for a lot of people who consider themselves kind of like old school labor rights activists, like this is the time for us to start to really quickly adjust our thinking and to start really putting racial justice kind of at the center of the conversation when we're talking about these things.
Yeah, I think that's really important to consider, specifically for the more privileged groups that are looking for a path forward.
Yeah.
And in relation to that, have you found anything? So you mentioned at the beginning of your book that Overdressed, writing your first book, Overdressed, and came out in 2012. You really were inspired to write this book. Anything in this book, anything that you wrote about that you thought, oh, this needs more, a bigger book to be dedicated to it? Anything that inspired you for a third book?
I mean, I think that what we're living through right now will inspire countless books. But I think that what I'm most excited about is hearing other perspectives come forward in the fashion industry. You know, I want to see books from people who work in the supply chain, people who own factories, people who work in factories, you know, Black and brown women's perspectives on sustainable fashion. So I feel very moved by this argument that we need to diversify the people that we're hearing from. And yeah, I really do agree that that is exactly what needs to happen. And I mean, with that said, like, yes, of course, I would love to write another book one day, but I right now I'm just like keeping my ears and my heart open to what other people are communicating.
Yeah, and I've seen that. We've even seen that with celebrities, you know, deferring the mic to a person, specifically a Black celebrity, etc., across all industries. So that's really great. So final question. Conscious fashion is obviously a huge topic. We've delved into some of the aspects of it. What is the one thing people who are watching right now that can, what can they do when they wake up tomorrow for a better fashion industry and therefore a better world?
I think
it's a big question.
no, I mean, the reason, you know, the conscious fashion movement really does start with consciousness raising. It's a commitment to educating yourself and to being aware. It's not really about you know, shopping. That's really one of the main things I wanted to convey with the book, is like, whether you overhaul your entire wardrobe or not is kind of besides the point. The point is to begin to understand that our clothes are connected to every aspect of our economy, to every aspect of our culture, to our history, both good and bad. And so to treat them as this like mindless purchase is a disservice to their importance in your life and to their importance in the world. So the easiest thing people can do tomorrow is just decide to become educated and aware of how their clothes are connected to everything around them.
Yeah, I really like that, because, you know, it's more than just a piece of fabric. It has a lot of implications, and I think that's obviously the major theme of your book, and I think people will really relate to the content of it.
Right. I mean, like, if you think about how aware people are of what they eat, or even the impact of like driving, there are all these other environmental issues that we're very, very keenly aware of. But with clothes, we sort of stubbornly cling to the idea that they don't matter. So I really just want to convey to people that your clothes matter a lot, a lot.
Yeah, thank you for that last piece of advice and that important message. I think this is a great way to conclude our chat. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you for talking with me about your book, The Conscious Closet. And for everyone watching, The Conscious Closet is available digitally and physically in our library. We also have Elizabeth Cline's first book, Overdressed. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.